The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that steady electric drone that became white noise after 8 months. Hannah Clarke had learned to tune it out the way combat medics learn to tune out the mortar fire: presence acknowledged, threat assessed, attention redirected. She moved through the corridors of St. Michael's with the kind of invisible efficiency that made her valuable precisely because no one noticed her. The nurses' station buzzed with controlled chaos, phones ringing, monitors beeping their mechanical heartbeats, the smell of antiseptic mixing with stale coffee from the break room pot that had been brewing since 6 in the morning. Cold stainless steel gleamed under the harsh white light. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was a skill, and Hannah had spent the last 8 months perfecting it. She adjusted the 4-line on her current patient, a 73-year-old with Coptic exacerbation, 3rd admission this year, and noted the O2 saturation at 94%, stable. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before, not just the official 8 months of her nursing record but the quiet years before that, the ones that didn't exist in anyone's personnel file. The trauma shears in her scrub pocket were worn smooth from handling, engraved along the handle with a call sign she hadn't spoken aloud in 4 years, Angel 6. She kept them partly out of habit, partly as a tether to the person she used to be, the one who didn't fold into the background of other people's hierarchies. The code came through the intercom at 9:47 in the morning. Trauma alert. GSW with unknown mechanism, altered level of consciousness, transport ETA 2 minutes. Hannah finished charting and moved toward the trauma bay like everyone else, but her body had already shifted into a different frequency. Her respiration had slowed. Her pupils had dilated slightly. 23 years and 4 months of muscle memory recognizing the shape of violence before the doors opened. He came through on a gurney with 4 paramedics moving in practiced unison, and the first thing Hannah noticed was that he wasn't moving. No grimacing, no protective positioning, just the slack collapse of a body that had shut down. Male, mid-30s, multiple lacerations, and what looked like a through-and-through wound to his upper left quadrant. But it was his face that made her pause, or rather, what wasn't there. His mouth was open but no sound emerged. Not unconscious. Present. But unable to speak. 38-year-old male, found unresponsive behind the warehouse district, the paramedic called out, moving with the stretcher. No identification, no medical alert, no known medical history. Vitals are all over the place, BP 110/70, heart rate 142, respiratory rate 28. We got 2 large bore lines in, running normal saline wide open. Dr. Hayes from trauma surgery was already moving, and the team mobilized around the patient like a choreographed response they'd practiced 1,000 times. Hannah stood at the perimeter, watching, assessing. The paramedics had done good work, the compression bandages were tight, the lines were secure, the monitor showed a sinus rhythm that was fast but organized. What concerned her was the patient's eyes. They were tracking. Aware. Terrified. The next 45 minutes unfolded like a machine grinding through its predetermined sequence. Dr. Hayes examined him with clinical efficiency. So did Dr. Sterling, the orthopedic consult. Dr. Pierce from general surgery came in, frowned, made notes, left without committing to care. Then came Dr. Gabriel, Dr. Bennett, Dr. Conrad. Each one spent between 4 and 7 minutes with the patient. Each one stepped back and offered the same calculus: the wound pattern was survivable, the vital signs were manageable, but the patient's inability to communicate created an insurmountable problem. No informed consent, Dr. Hayes said, already moving to the next patient. Can't operate without confirmation of his medical history, allergies, advance directives. He could be on anticoagulants, could have a contraindication to anesthesia. It's liability. Not our problem, Dr. Sterling added, his tone suggesting he'd already moved on to more tractable cases. Get neurology, get psych. Figure out why he's not talking. Until then, supportive care only. By the time Dr. Mercer arrived, chief of surgery, expensive watch catching the hospital lights as he moved through the trauma bay, 10 physicians had already declined. 10 separate refusals. Hannah watched from her position by the medication cart, still holding her notebook, still absorbing. Dr. Mercer examined the patient for exactly 3 minutes. He looked at the wound. He looked at the patient's face. He looked back at the wound. Same issue, he said. Liability. No way to get consent. Keep him comfortable, call the county hospital. They deal with John does. The room was emptying now. The urgency had been replaced with bureaucratic resignation. The patient's eyes were still tracking, still aware, still searching the faces around him for someone who would stay. Hannah set down her notebook. She moved toward the patient's bedside and made eye contact with him. Not speaking yet. Just acknowledging. She'd done this before, in places where the language barrier wasn't a choice but a consequence of geography, of velocity, of how quickly a man could go from whole to shattered. She looked at the monitors. Sinus rhythm. Oxygenation adequate. Blood pressure holding. The medical picture was salvageable. The legal picture was a minefield. The human picture was a man who needed help. "I'll take him," she said. Her voice was quiet, it always was, but it carried the weight of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms full of explosions and alarms. "I can work with him." Dr. Mercer turned. His expression was difficult to read, but Hannah caught the flicker of something dismissive cross his face. "You're a nurse." "Yes, sir." "Then your role is supporting the physician who makes the decision, not making it yourself." "I understand. But he needs someone to advocate for him." "I can do that." Dr. Mercer studied her for a moment. Admirable instinct. Terrible strategy. He didn't say no explicitly, but he didn't say yes either. He simply walked away, leaving the patient in a kind of medical limbo, transferred to a guarded ICU bed but with no attending physician claiming ownership of his case. Hannah stayed with him through the afternoon shift. She cleaned his wounds with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done field medicine under conditions far worse than a hospital's clean environment. She changed his dressings with movements so precise, so economical, that every gesture seemed to anticipate the next one. There was no hesitation, no moment of uncertainty. The trauma shears came out of her pocket without thought, cutting gauze and tape with surgical accuracy. She was finishing the sterile dressing change on his left shoulder when a voice spoke behind her. "I know that technique." She turned. It was Marcus, the transport worker she'd seen in the hallways a few times, someone who moved with the same economy of motion she did, the same awareness of exits and angles. He was watching her hands with an expression that had shifted into something like recognition. "That's military technique," Marcus said quietly. "Field medicine application on a hospital patient. I've seen that in Helmand Province. I've seen that taught in the 75th Ranger Regiment Advanced Trauma course." Hannah didn't stop moving. She secured the last piece of tape, checked the fall line, verified the monitor one more time. Only then did she turn to face him fully. "I was a combat medic," she said. "Before nursing." It wasn't technically a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. Marcus nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle had suddenly aligned. "You served?" "Yes." The moment stretched between them. He studied her face, searching for something in her features that confirmed what his training recognized. Hannah let him look. This was part of the vulnerability she allowed only in small doses, in private moments that felt almost like the truth because they contained enough of it to matter. "Angel 6, Marcus said." It wasn't a question. Hannah's hands paused. That call sign hadn't been spoken in 4 years. Hearing it out loud, in a hospital hallway in Denver, felt like surfacing from a depth where the pressure should have killed her. She looked at Marcus, and in his eyes she saw the shape of someone who had been where she had been, seen what she had seen. "I know you," Marcus said. "Not personally. But the story." Everyone in Helmand knew the Angel 6 story. Combat medic who walked into fire for her unit. The one who... "I need to check on my other patients," Hannah interrupted. Her voice was still quiet, still steady, but there was an edge to it now. A warning. She moved past him toward the door. Behind her, she heard him say softly, "Your secret's safe." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the hallway with the knowledge that invisibility, once fractured, was nearly impossible to fully restore. The fluorescent lights cast their flat white pallor across the Grand Rounds conference room as Dr. Mercer stood at the head of 37 residents, attending physicians, and medical students gathered around the central screen displaying patient files. Hannah stood at the back corner, her hands folded, listening to the morning briefings cycle through case after case with clinical precision. The room smelled of stale coffee and the particular staleness of recirculated air that only hospital hallways knew. Then Mercer's tone shifted. His voice took on a pedagogical quality, the kind reserved for teaching moments. He pulled up a case summary, the Green Beret's initial presentation, and began to speak. "This case illustrates a critical failure in institutional risk management," Mercer said, his eyes scanning the room, landing deliberately on Hannah. "When emotional decision-making supersedes protocol, we compromise not only our legal standing but the integrity of informed consent itself." One staff member volunteered to assume care of this catastrophically injured patient without documented ability to communicate, establish a medical history, or obtain meaningful consent. This is exactly what we cannot permit. The room shifted. Heads turned slightly, tracking Mercer's gaze to Hannah. She felt it like a pressure change, like stepping from one altitude to another. She did not move. Her breathing remained even, measured. A junior resident in the second row, a woman named Dr. Chen, smirked and whispered something to her colleague. The colleague's mouth twitched upward. Mercer continued, his voice smooth as oil across water. "Emotional decision-making is a liability. It clouds judgment. It puts patients at risk. And it puts this institution at considerable legal and financial risk. We are physicians, not social workers. We are bound by protocols for reasons that transcend sentiment." Hannah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. That was all. A single muscle contraction, barely visible. She continued standing, her hand steady, her posture unchanged. The room waited, perhaps unconsciously, for her to react, to defend herself, to respond, to show some crack in the facade. Nothing came. She simply looked back at Mercer with the flatness of a still pond. The moment stretched. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly, frustrated by her absolute lack of response. He had expected anger, or tears, or an outburst he could then characterize as unprofessional. Instead, he got nothing. He got the kind of composure that only came from people who had learned, in difficult places, that showing emotion was a luxury they could not afford. "Let this be a lesson," Mercer concluded, turning back to the screen. "Protocol exists for protection. All protection. Ours included." The grand rounds continued. The moment passed. But it did not disappear. 2 hours later, Hannah was at the vending machine on the third-floor landing, feeding in coins for black coffee she did not particularly want but needed as a reason to be somewhere alone. The machine hummed and clicked, processing her selection. She heard voices before she saw their owners, Mercer and an administrator named Paul Hendricks, the kind of administrator who approved budgets and signed off on personnel decisions. They rounded the corner, not yet seeing her. Mercer was already speaking, his voice pitched low but not carefully low, he was confident in his privacy. "She'll be gone by week's end," Mercer said. "I've already started the documentation. Emotional instability, poor judgment, patient endangerment through unauthorized protocol deviation. By Friday, security will be escorting her out. HR is already prepared with the termination paperwork." Hendricks made a sound of agreement. "You think the board will push back?" "They won't even see it coming," Mercer said. "I'm isolating her now. Reassigning her support staff, altering her schedule to maximize her solo shifts. By the time I file the formal complaint, she'll be visibly falling apart from fatigue. Burnout. Desperation. It's textbook. They'll be relieved to let her go." The coffee machine dispensed Hannah's selection with a mechanical thunk. She retrieved it without turning, without acknowledging that she had heard every word with perfect clarity. Her hands did not shake as she closed her fingers around the plastic cup. Her breathing did not accelerate. She turned and walked back toward the patient care units, moving past Mercer and Hendricks as though she had not been present for any of it, as though they were simply walls she navigated around. Mercer watched her go. His expression shifted, a flash of annoyance at not being able to read whether she had heard him. But he said nothing. He turned back to Hendricks and continued talking about next steps. The shift structure changed that very afternoon. Hannah's name vanished from the team roster and reappeared at odd hours, 3 p.m. to midnight one day, then 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. the next, then back to early morning with a gap of only 4 hours for rest. Her regular support staff, the respiratory therapist who had worked with her smoothly, the nursing assistant who anticipated her needs, were suddenly assigned to other units. New staff rotated in, people unfamiliar with the Green Beret's specific care requirements, people who did not yet understand his patterns or preferences. The isolation tightened like a noose, but Hannah moved through it with the same steady precision she had always possessed. On her 3 consecutive night shifts with the patient, she was alone in ways that became increasingly apparent. When she needed supplies, no one came quickly. When she needed assistance, the unit felt understaffed. When she charted her notes, she was hyper-aware of Mercer's absence, of the way no attending was checking in on her work, of the professional abandonment that was being orchestrated with careful deliberation. But she returned to the patient's bedside after each truncated break. She performed her assessments. She documented her findings. She maintained her composure the way soldiers maintain weapons in hostile territory, not because it came naturally, but because it was essential to survival. The night of the second shift, standing alone at the patient's bedside at 2:13 a.m. while monitors hummed their mechanical cadence and the hospital around her seemed to hold its breath, Hannah looked down at the Green Beret's face. His eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell with mechanical assistance. And she understood, with the kind of clarity that transcends denial, that Mercer was going to succeed. That by week's end, she would be gone. That her mission here, the real reason she had come to St. Michael's, the reason her presence at this hospital was classified and compartmentalized, would be compromised. She pressed her hand briefly against her scrubs, feeling the shape of the object beneath the fabric. The military challenge coin in her pocket. The weight of it. The weight of everything. She had survived worse. She had always survived worse. But she had never survived by running away. The 3rd consecutive night shift had worn grooves into Hannah's bones. 38 hours without sleep wasn't a problem. She'd done 47 in Helmand Province on nothing but dextrose tablets and adrenaline, but the isolation Dr. Mercer had orchestrated was a different animal. Every nurse who'd been assigned to help her had been quietly reassigned. The schedule had been altered so her breaks never aligned with anyone else's. Even the respiratory therapist who usually checked ventilators at 3 a.m. had been moved to another floor. She was alone with her patient in a way that felt deliberate. Strategic. A ticking clock disguised as understaffing. The Green Beret's name was never given to her. Patient designation, male, 34, service-connected pneumatic injuries, cognitive and verbal impairment unknown origin. 10 doctors had examined him in sequence and 10 had walked away. Hannah had read the chart notes. Liability exposure. Informed consent impossible. Recommend palliative care consultation. The language was clinical. The message was cowardice. She'd volunteered anyway, and now the hospital was making sure she'd pay for that decision in isolation, in exhaustion, in the kind of abandonment that was meant to break someone into compliance. At 2:51 a.m., the ventilator began to wheeze differently. Not an alarm. Not yet. Just a change in rhythm that Hannah's ears caught because she'd been sitting 3 feet from his bed for 19 hours, listening to the machine's mechanical song like it was her own heartbeat. The patient was sedated, propofol drip, paralyzed with vecuronium, so he couldn't tell her what was wrong. The monitors told the story instead. O2 saturation dropping. 94, 91. 88. She moved before thinking. I need a portable chest X-ray, she said into the call button, knowing no one would answer. The tech station was 2 floors down. The resident covering this unit tonight was Dr. Pierce, Mercer's ally, a man who'd made eye contact with her exactly once, with contempt. She wouldn't wait for him. Couldn't. The oxygen sat continued its descent. 87, 85. 82. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis assembled itself from muscle memory and clinical data colliding. The right lung had collapsed. Air was accumulating in the pleural space. Pressure building. Suffocating him from the inside while the machines pretended everything was normal. If she waited for a physician, for permission, for the chain of command to process through the men who wanted her gone, the patient would arrest. She had maybe 8 minutes before his heart stopped. The crash cart was 40 feet away. The needle decompression kit was on the emergency supplies shelf. Hannah stood, her body moving with the fluid precision that came from having done this 17 times before in conditions that made a hospital ICU look like a spa. Her hands found the equipment. Chlorhexidine wipe. 14-gauge angiocath needle. She didn't think about protocol. Protocol was written by people who'd never held someone's life in their hands while watching them slip away. She positioned herself at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers found the anatomy by touch, the ridge of rib, the space between, the exact point where needle goes in. The patient's chest was still. Paralyzed. Waiting. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and pushed the needle through skin, through muscle, through membrane, into the collapsed space where death was gathering like clouds. The hiss was instantaneous. Pressurized air escaping. The sound of a lung learning to breathe again. The monitors responded immediately. O2 saturation climbing. 84, 87. 91. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser, the needle gliding with the certainty of someone who'd performed this procedure in a dust storm while rounds were landing and the smell of hot brass casing mixed with blood and antiseptic and fear. Here in the clean fluorescent hum of St. Michael's, it was almost meditative. 95, 97. 98. Sinus rhythm holding. Pressure normalizing. The patient's vital signs stabilizing like a ship finding harbor. Hannah left the needle in place. He'd need a proper chest tube, a real resuscitation now that he could breathe again, and reached for the phone to call the resident. Her finger was on the button when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Dr. Pierce appeared, bleary from whatever on-call room he'd been sleeping in. His eyes registered the scene, the patient stable, the needle in place, Hannah standing with her hands at her sides like she'd just finished pruning roses. "What did you do?" His voice was thin with alarm, the kind that came from walking into a situation already resolved. Needle decompression. Tension pneumothorax. He was desaturating. Hannah kept her voice level. "Matter of fact. You'll need to place a chest tube and get imaging. Portable first, then CT when he's stable enough to move." Dr. Pierce stared at the needle, at the patient, at Hannah. His jaw tightened. "You performed a procedure without authorization. The patient was dying." Still that steady voice. The voice of someone who'd given orders in 3 languages while under fire. Protocol is secondary to patient outcome. The resident's face darkened. He moved to the bedside and examined her work with the reluctant precision of someone who couldn't argue with results. The needle was perfectly placed. The saturation was perfect. The patient was breathing. And Hannah Clarke, the nurse he'd been told was too emotional, too unstable, too much of a liability, had just performed an emergency intervention with the kind of technical precision that didn't come from watching YouTube videos. "I'm going to need to document this," Pierce said quietly. "Please do." Hannah was already moving toward the supply cabinet to prepare for the chest tube. Her movements were efficient, practiced, stripped of all hesitation. She pulled the necessary equipment with the grace of someone who'd done this before. Sterile field. 8 mm chest tube. Heimlich valve. Chest X-ray confirmation. The paralytic would need to be reversed before they could assess for pneumonia or other complications, but that was secondary. First priority was inflation. Pierce watched her work. His resentment was obvious, the kind that came from being upstaged by someone he'd been told to dismiss, but he couldn't argue with competence. Hannah's hands moved through the preparation like she was reading a language older than words, older than credentials, older than the institutional hierarchy that said a nurse should never decide when a doctor was needed. This was muscle memory from Helmand Province, from a 2007 fire base where a medic and a half-dozen soldiers had learned to keep each other alive with whatever tools they had and whatever knowledge fit in a trauma bag. For just a moment, Pierce stared at her hands. The calluses at the base of her palms. The scar tissue along her knuckles. The way she handled the chest tube like it was an extension of her body rather than a foreign object. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Hannah didn't look up. "The hospital sent me to a weekend training. 3 years ago." The lie was smooth. Automatic. She'd learned to lie in the service, had become fluent in the dialect of concealment. "I've done this in simulation." Seemed worth remembering. Pierce didn't believe her. She could see it in his eyes, that flicker of recognition that something wasn't matching the narrative he'd been given. But he was a resident, not Mercer, and challenging her about her credentials would require him to admit he was uncertain. So he did what younger doctors always did when confronted with competence they couldn't quite explain. He made a note to tell the chief of surgery. The chest tube went in cleanly. The patient's saturation stabilized at 99. His heart rate came down from 142 to 87. X-ray tech arrived within 7 minutes and confirmed proper placement. No other pneumothorax. No hemothorax. Just a collapsed lung that had been suffocating him, and a nurse who'd been trained by the best emergency medics the military had ever produced. Hannah sat back in her chair when it was over. Her hands were trembling slightly, but not from fear or relief. The trembling was something else. Something that came from every cell in her body remembering what it felt like to be a captain in the field, making decisions that kept people alive. Remembering that this was the work she'd been born to do, and that St. Michael's had tried to strip it away from her because a surgeon was afraid she'd notice his fraud. She didn't cry. She didn't let the exhaustion show. She sat in the chair and watched her patient breathe, and waited for the reckoning she knew was coming. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. The reckoning came at 2:13 p.m. on a Tuesday. Dr. Mercer's voice carried through the hospital's administrative wing with the precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. Hannah was in Bay 7, documenting vitals, when she heard him on the phone with the medical board's licensing committee. His words traveled through the open door like smoke seeping under a wall. Emergency needle decompression. Second intercostal space. Performed by a registered nurse without physician authorization or supervision. Practicing medicine without a license, textbook violation. Yes. Yes, I have witnesses. A pause. The patient is stable only because she got lucky. Protocol exists for a reason. Liability exposure is substantial. Hannah's hands continued their work. Steady. Methodical. The four-line didn't shake as she repositioned it. Her eyes didn't flicker toward the open door. But her breathing changed, slower now, more controlled. The kind of breathing a soldier uses when incoming fire hits the perimeter. She had saved his life. The monitors proved it. Sinus rhythm. O2 sat climbing from 68 to 87 to 94. The patient's chest rising and falling with actual air instead of the suffocating collapse of a tension pneumothorax. All of it documented. All of it real. And now Mercer was rewriting the narrative into a weapon. By 3:41 p.m., ICU access restrictions appeared on the hospital intranet. Effective immediately. All post-operative monitoring assignments transferred to appropriately supervised nursing staff. Hannah's name was conspicuously absent from the roster. The restriction was surgical in its precision, not a blanket firing, but a slow amputation. Keep her employed. Keep her visible. Just remove her ability to be anywhere near the patient. She read the notice while standing at the medication dispensary. A junior resident glanced sideways at her, saw no reaction, and looked away quickly. The kind of look people give to things they don't understand. Dangerous things. By 5:07 p.m., Security Director Walsh appeared at the nursing station with 2 folders and the kind of expression that meant he'd been asked to do something unpleasant. He found Hannah in the break room, alone except for a vending machine that hummed like it was considering its own mortality. Hannah. Not hostile. Just official. We need to talk about your credential status. She turned from the coffee she wasn't drinking. Waited. Medical board called. They're recommending a temporary suspension pending investigation into the needle decompression incident. Hospital administration concurs. Effective immediately, your RN license is suspended. You can continue working administrative duties only, pending outcome of the board's review. He opened the first folder. The papers inside were crisp, expensive-looking, final. I'm sorry. These are your termination papers. 2-week severance. Your security badge will be deactivated at end of shift. Hannah looked at the papers the way a soldier looks at a casualty report, as information that needed processing, not as a personal tragedy. She didn't read them. Didn't question them. Didn't ask for an explanation that both of them knew wouldn't be truthful. When? One word. Flat as a runway. Now. You'll need to clear your locker and leave the premises within the hour. I'll walk you out if you want, or you can go alone. Your choice. She chose alone. The locker room was empty. Fluorescent panels buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Hannah's locker was third from the end, painted institutional grey, indistinguishable from every other locker in the row. She opened it slowly. Her spare scrubs hung on the hook, 3 pairs, each folded with military precision. A stainless steel water bottle. 2 pairs of shoes. A paperback copy of a novel she'd never opened. And inside the jacket pocket, sewn into the lining where no one would find it unless they were specifically looking, the faded unit patch from Helmand Province. 4th Brigade, 2nd Battalion. The colors already bleeding away, desert tan fading toward white, the embroidered edges fraying where bullets had creased the fabric. Her brother's unit. The unit she'd been placed at St. Michael's to protect. She pulled the scrubs from the hanger one at a time. Each one felt warm still, as if her body heat had lingered in the fabric longer than it should have. The hospital laundry facility was 3 levels down, past the morgue refrigerators that hummed like sleeping giants. The industrial washer stood in rows, massive stainless steel drums that could process 150 pounds of fabric at a time. Steam rose from the open vats. Hannah fed the first pair of scrubs into the collection bin. The fabric rustled as it fell. The second pair followed. Then the third. She watched them disappear into the darkness of the hamper, and something in her chest tightened. Not pain. Something harder than pain. Something that soldiers know how to carry. Her name badge hung on the lanyard around her neck. Hannah Clarke, RN, St. Michael's Hospital, Denver. 8 months. 8 months of sterile dressing changes and vital sign documentation and keeping her real hands hidden beneath the gloves of someone pretending to be ordinary. She removed the lanyard slowly and placed it in a fabric bin on top of her scrubs. The laminated card caught the fluorescent light as it tumbled down. That was the moment, that exact moment when the badge disappeared into the darkness, when her cover collapsed. Mission failure. The green beret was for floors above her, stabilized and healing, but now unprotected. Now vulnerable to whoever might have sent him to St. Michael's in the first place. Now exposed. Hannah turned away from the bin. Walked to the parking garage. The concrete smelled like diesel exhaust and rust. Her car was a grey 2019 Civic parked on level 2, far enough from the entrance that she'd be alone. The rain started as she reached the stairwell, not falling but driven horizontal by wind coming down from the front range, hitting the concrete with the sound of gravel being thrown. She sat in the driver's seat for 17 minutes without starting the engine. The parking garage was silent except for the rain on the roof and the occasional car passing on the street above. Water streamed down the windshield in sheets. Hannah's hands rested on the steering wheel, steady as surgical instruments, and her eyes were on the unit patch she'd pulled from her jacket lining. Faded. Stained. A piece of history from a place where her brother had died, covering a medical evacuation that never came. The patch sat on the dashboard. In the grey light, she could barely read the unit designation. 4th Brigade, 2nd Battalion. The same unit the Green Beret had served with. The same unit she'd been protecting without him knowing. Mercer had taken that from her. Removed her from proximity to the only piece of her brother's legacy left in Denver. She reached for the patch. For a moment, just a moment, she considered rolling down the window and letting the rain take it. 7 years of carrying it in secret. 7 years of wearing it next to her skin like a scar that wouldn't heal. Easier to let it go. Easier to stop fighting. Her fingers touched the fabric, and she felt the slight curve of the embroidered edge where stitching had come loose. Someone had sewn this carefully. Someone who knew what they were doing. Someone military. Hannah pulled the patch back and held it against her chest. Her phone was on the seat beside her, screen dark. No missed calls. No messages of support from staff who'd watched Mercer destroy her. No reaching out. No risk. That was how institutional power worked. It isolated the target first, then it killed them quietly. She was about to start the engine when she heard it. Distant. Growing louder. The sound of rotor blades cutting through rain-thick air. Hannah's head came up. Helicopter. No, more than one. The sound was layered, multiple aircraft synchronized, coming from the north. Too heavy for news helicopters. Too many. The sound filled the parking garage, echoing off concrete walls, growing from distant thunder to present fact. She grabbed the unit patch and stepped out of the car into the rain. The rotor wash hit her face before she heard the engines. Rain streaked sideways. The unit patch felt thin in her hand, cotton and thread, fading colors that meant everything. She turned toward the sound. The helicopter descended through Denver's night sky like a descending angel, running lights cutting through cloud cover, and Hannah's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. That was a Black Hawk. 160th SAW. Night Stalkers. The ER erupted 2 minutes later. Trauma alert. GSW to the abdomen. Afghan national. The doors burst open and the stretcher wheels squeaked across tile like they always did, but this time Hannah didn't move. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She was a terminated employee in the parking garage. Except her feet carried her toward the ER anyway, and nobody stopped her. The Afghan man was bleeding hard, dark arterial flow, the kind that doesn't wait for permission. 3 nurses converged. 2 doctors appeared from the back. And then the patient's eyes locked on Hannah as she stepped into the trauma bay, and his voice cut through the chaos in Pashto. The Angel of Helmand. She saved my brother's unit when the medevac couldn't land. That's her. That's the angel. The room froze. Suction hissed. Monitor beeped its indifferent rhythm. A Marine Corps liaison was standing at the chart desk. He'd been reviewing transferred records, routine intake paperwork, when the patient's shout made him stop cold. His jaw moved. He turned. He looked at Hannah. His voice dropped to the kind of quiet that carries more weight than a scream. Captain Hannah Clarke. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. You're that Clarke. Nobody moved. Dr. Mercer appeared from the corner of the ER, his surgical mask hanging loose around his neck like a surrender flag. His face had that familiar expression, the one he wore when he was about to issue orders he expected the world to obey. He opened his mouth. Took 1 step forward. This is a terminated employee with no clearance. Security needs to. Stand down, doctor. The voice came from the entrance. It wasn't loud. It was quieter than Mercer's, which meant it carried everything. A two-star general in dress blue stepped through the ER doors, and the air pressure in the room changed. The insignia on his shoulders were the kind that required a room to reorganize itself instantly. Captain Clarke, thank you for maintaining your cover. The Pentagon confirms mission success. Your patient is scheduled for extraction in 4 hours. The general's eyes moved to Mercer. Only for a moment. That was enough. Get her a clean set of scrubs, the general said to no one in particular. Everyone. She's operating. Hannah didn't remember moving. Muscle memory took over. The scrubs appeared. Her hands moved, starting the second line, checking labs, prepping equipment for the surgeon who would arrive in 90 seconds. The Afghan man's eye stayed on her. My brother. His name was Karzai. You pulled him from a burning Humvee. He made it. Hannah's voice sounded like it belonged to someone else now. Deeper. Steadier. The voice of a person who wasn't pretending anymore. Married. 2 daughters. Because of you. The patient's eyes closed. Blood pressure dropping. Angel 6. We always knew you were real. The surgery took 53 minutes. Surgical exploration of the abdomen, hemorrhage control, splenectomy, repair of the hepatic laceration with 2-0 chromic sutures. Hannah assisted with the precision of someone who'd done this in forward operating bases under mortar fire, and the surgeon, an older colonel from BAMC, glanced at her twice and nodded. He knew. Of course he knew. The Pentagon knew. Everyone knew except the one person who should have. Dr. Mercer had disappeared. He reappeared at 11:48 p.m. in the hospital administrator's office, where federal auditors were reviewing billing records that Hannah had quietly flagged during her routine documentation review. The auditors, 3 of them, FBI badges catching the fluorescent light, had already found the discrepancies. 437 ghost procedures over 3 years. $812,000 in fraudulent billing codes. Phantom surgeries. Inflated anesthesia charges. Names of dead patients used on current invoices. Dr. Mercer walked in demanding to know why his credentials were being questioned. He didn't notice the recording equipment. He didn't notice the way the federal agents exchanged glances. He just started talking. Started explaining. Started lying. The lies came faster and faster, and when one agent quietly told him they'd already reviewed the security footage from the operating room, the surgeries that never happened, the equipment never opened, the staff never called, Mercer's face did something that Hannah had never seen before. It broke. He lunged for the filing cabinet. 1 agent moved. 2. His hands were behind his back in a smooth motion that looked almost gentle, and the handcuffs clicked, sound traveling through the hallway like a judge's gavel. The agents walked him out past the vending machines where he told the administrator that Hannah would be gone by week's end, possibly escorted out by security. He passed the vending machines now. Different kind of escort. The nursing staff watched from the hallway. Nobody said anything. The silence was the most destructive thing in the building. Hannah was standing at her patient's bedside when they rolled him toward the extraction point. A military transport team had assembled, for medics in flight suits, equipment bags with government property markings, a stretcher with restraint systems for airlift. The general stood at the patient's head. Thank you for the extraction window, Captain. Command sends their regards. Yes, sir. Hannah helped lift the stretcher. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. Everything was steady because everything was finally aligned. The stretcher tilted. The patient shifted. Something fell from inside his jacket lining, fabric catching the edge of a monitor, fluttering to the tile floor. A unit patch. Faded. Stitched. The colors bleeding into each other after years of being worn, stored, cherished. Helmand Province. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. The same unit her brother had died serving. The same unit she'd been inserted to monitor. The same unit that had sent a critically injured asset to St. Michael's Hospital in Denver, where the universe had arranged for Hannah Clarke to be the only person in the entire city with the clearance, the training, and the reason to save him. She picked up the patch, held it for a moment, then placed it carefully in the patient's hand. "Your brother sends his love," she said quietly. It was a lie. Her brother had been killed in Sanjin Valley in 2019. But it was also the truest thing she'd said in 8 months. The patient's hand closed around the patch, and his eyes met hers one final time. Understanding. Recognition. Gratitude that transcended language. They wheeled him out. The Black Hawk engines fired. The rotor wash shook the windows again, and Hannah watched from the helipad access as they lifted into Denver's night sky, disappearing into the clouds the way ghosts disappear into the dark. The hospital administrator found her an hour later in the break room. "Captain Clarke, we owe you an apology. Dr. Mercer's actions." "I need my job back," Hannah said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a question. Nursing. Trauma. Full credentials. And I want the veterans wing built. Pro bono care for anyone who served. Non-negotiable. The administrator nodded. She'd expected exactly this. Done. Actually, more than done. The chief of surgery position is yours if you want it. Hannah was quiet for a moment. She thought about Dr. Mercer, probably in a holding cell right now, his mind trying to calculate how everything had gone wrong so fast. She thought about the 10 doctors who'd refused the Green Beret's case. She thought about the lie she'd lived for 8 months, folding scrubs in a laundry room while her brother's unit patch waited to fall from a jacket lining. "No," she said finally. "I'll take the trauma rotation. And I want to train the nurses who'll work with me. Hands-on. Real medicine. Not bureaucracy." The administrator started to smile, realized it was the wrong response, and simply nodded. "Welcome back, Captain." Hannah was back in the trauma bay by 4:13 a.m., checking vitals on a 68-year-old with acute MI, her hands gentle on his wrist, reading his pulse like it was a language she'd learned in a war zone and perfected in a hospital. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind that comes from having held back everything for so long that finally letting it out feels like disarming a bomb. She'd been a nurse. She'd been a soldier. She'd been a spy. And now she was all three, and nobody would ever know the difference. A younger nurse was watching her work. "How do you do that?" the nurse asked. "Stay so calm." Hannah didn't answer immediately. She just kept her fingers on the monitor, watching the EKG rhythm steady under her care. "Some of us have learned that panic doesn't save lives," she said finally. "Hands do. Training does. Knowing that when you're the only one standing between someone and death, you don't get the luxury of falling apart." The nurse nodded like she understood. She didn't. Not yet. But maybe someday. By 6:36 a.m., the sun was rising over Denver, and Hannah was sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a terrible cup of coffee that tasted exactly the way it always had. A former combat medic, not Marcus this time, someone new, sat down across from her. "Captain Clarke." He didn't wait for an answer. "I heard what you did. For that Green Beret. For all of us. I just wanted to say." "You don't have to say anything," Hannah said quietly. But she reached across the table and put her hand on his arm for just a moment. That was all the veteran's language that was necessary. He understood. When she got home that evening, there was a letter in her mailbox. Official Pentagon seal. It contained a new assignment. Different hospital. Different city. Different patient. The work didn't end. It just transformed, like everything else, into something that looked normal to the outside world but required everything underneath. She set the letter on her kitchen counter next to her brother's photograph. In the picture, he was in dress blues. Smiling. Alive. The kind of alive that photographs could preserve but nothing else could. She touched the frame once. Just once. Then she put on fresh scrubs and prepared for her next shift. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. So here's my question for you: if you discovered that your workplace was harboring corruption, and speaking up meant destroying your cover, ending your mission, and losing everything you'd built, would you stay silent? Or would you become the person who burns it all down? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to follow more stories about the quiet warriors among us, the ones you'll never see coming, subscribe and hit that notification bell.